to the newest episode in the Owens Recovery Science podcast catalog. On this episode, President and founder Johnny Owens speaks with Dr. Luke Hughes of the University of Northumbria. They discuss Dr. Hughes' work on blood flow restriction exercise and how it might be used to assist space travelers like myself in recovery back to terrestrial living. They are joined by barbecue enthusiast and beard care expert Kyle Kimbrell, as well as Benjamin Chicken Legs Weatherford. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce the podcast as legendary wingman Ed McMahon used to say, "Here's Gianni."
What's up, fellas? I got Ben Weatherford back on the podcast. Kyle Kimbrell running the wheels of steel. Gonna drop in some bad jokes every now and then. And then I got my Welsh brother from another mother, third time appearance on our podcast, Luke Hughes. Welcome back, Luke Hughes. He's here. He's there. He's every fucking where, Luke Hughes. Hughes. Lasso.
So it only took 3 times to get a good, nice introduction. But thanks.
Oh yeah, man.
We left Johnny in charge of the intro this time, Luke. It's normally me, so that's why.
I loved it. Thanks, Johnny.
Yeah, man. Do you watch Wrexham? The show?
That's where I'm from, isn't it? So it's big hype around the town. Yeah, that's my hometown.
That's your hometown?
Yeah, that's my hometown. So I live.
Awesome.
I didn't realize we haven't actually spoke about this yet, but yeah. So that's my hometown. So the racecourse ground. I live probably about a 3-minute drive from there. I've played football on that stadium.
No way.
I've been watching Wrexham since I was able to walk, and my dad used to take me. When we had a little bit of glory back in 2005 was my highlight when went to played in the cup LW Vans Cup final, Millennium Stadium, where I dyed my hair red. My dad made me dye my hair red, and then I got suspended from school on the Monday. But then we were rubbish for about 10 years, and it's interesting.
But now you're coming back, baby.
We're coming back. Got that Hollywood money, so
I know
it's exciting time at the time.
Have you guys watched it, Ben, Kyle?
No, I'm just ready to ask. What are we? I don't even know what we're talking about right now.
Oh, we're talking about
the
real football, and these guys zone out right now. So Ryan Reynolds and I'm blanking on the other guy's name who does
from Always Sunny.
Rob,
yeah,
Rob McElhenney.
They bought this Welsh lowest level, I guess. Sorry, Luke. League team. Yeah. Who've been struggling in this little Welsh town, and so it's a documentary of them trying to bring this club back to glory.
Well, it's actually real.
Cool. Yeah, it's a documentary on Hulu.
Oh, I thought it was fake, like it was a show, and it was all fictitious.
No, man. Ryan Reynolds brought in all that gin money and that Marvel superhero money, and they're buying good players now, and it's coming back, man. Yeah,
they're buying good players from 2 or 3 leagues above, which is ultimately why we're doing well. But it's awesome. Like it's real, Kyle. When you eventually come over to this side of the pond for the first time, all of you will have to take a trip to Wrexham.
I'm in. Yes. And you know what else? I want to go see that. Is it the hurling? Is that Welsh hurling too? Hurling?
No, that's that's Irish.
That's right. It's Irish. That's Stephen.
That's a brutal sport, man. We We can go watch, but there's no way I'm playing.
I don't want to play it. No, it looked
sport.
brutal, but it looked like super entertaining to watch. Have you guys seen hurling before?
With the giant, where they flip the giant piece of wood?
No, it's like, it's some weird kind of hybrid between lacrosse and like rugby and baseball. They have these long handled paddle looking things that are, I think they're leather. So they have kind of like this scoop sort of paddle. And then there's this ball that they literally like flick it in the air and they take a full swing like a baseball bat and hit it. And they play on this massive field. But I think what is the most interesting about that sport, beyond, I had never ever seen it before, and I saw a commercial, I saw like a report on it or something on flipping through channels. It's towns or counties that basically compete against one another. Like they have their own team, and it's very, very strict, like who can be on your team, you know. So it's like just very kind of pure in that regard. I felt like there's like Ryan Reynolds ain't coming in and corrupting hurling, you know. Like we're not getting this kind of thing happening. It's just like your community, your people, are you good or not, you know? And you know, a couple really legit players could literally like transform like a community kind of thing. So it's kind of neat. From that.
So how did you come across this? Like,
dude, I don't know.
What kind of research were you doing when you came across hurling?
That was one of those. That was my question, Ben.
Yeah,
I was wondering
super random.
It's super Sports Quarterly, ESPN.
Took them like 20 minutes to explain it.
It might have been the Ocho. It might have
ESPN 8, the Ocho.
There's potential that it was that. I don't know. It was. I just remember sitting fascinated, like what are they actually talking about right now?
Right after the cornhole championships, and okay.
No, hey, cornhole's prime time now, Ben. There's big money. In fact, there's corruption in cornhole I saw recently. So
yeah, that and fishing.
They're using
weights
inside their
fish. They put weights in the fish.
And they're like messing with the bag. They're deflating the cornhole bags. It's like Tom Brady and Robert Kraft got their
Deflategate, man.
Into got their tentacles into cornhole somehow. So
my local yokel cousins out in West Texas, they got busted in competition with steers because they glued fake hair on it to make it look like it had more hair, and so the hair started falling off during the competition. So
what is that? Are they judging the steers by their appearance?
Well, I guess if you have hair in certain spots, you know, like it's good. Like Kyle, if you had hair on your head, you would be like much more marketable. So having hair in the right places matters.
Oh my god.
Anyways, moving on. So the reason why
this is a
wasn't I the one that was supposed to make the bad jokes?
The reason why we have our man Luke on again for the third time is he's made a shift. He's gone up to the orbits above the Earth, so he's working in space now, or working on space things now with BFR. And so Ben and I just were able to go hang out and work at NASA a little bit for a day. Wish we were there for longer. We got the coolest tour, the tour I didn't get to have when I was a kid on my field trip to NASA. We got the behind the scenes tour. So, and Luke had already been talking with NASA there with our friends. And so Luke, welcome back, man, and want to give us kind of an overview of what you're doing now and kind of the cool things you're seeing.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Johnny. Well, first of all, I am extremely jealous of that thought because I haven't ever been over to there, so that's something on my bucket list. So at the minute, as of was January, February this year, I'm now up in the northeast of England, where the Vikings are, as Kyle always says, and I'm working in the aerospace medicine and rehabilitation lab here at Northumbria University. So we're working on three kind of key space-related projects, which are funded by the UK Space Agency and ESA. So the main kind of focus of the current projects is looking at lumbopelvic deconditioning with space flight. So to give you the short, when astronauts go to space, when there's no head-to-toe loading, the spine extends and the spinal curvature changes, muscles of the lower back atrophy, and then this leads to lower back pain and altered kinematics. So when they come back to Earth, they need quite extensive reconditioning. So we're looking at tracking this in astronauts, European and NASA astronauts before and after spaceflight. So I will get to come over to your side of the pond and your end, Johnny.
Nice. We'll meet you there.
Do some testing, and then we test them when they come back from the space station approximately 6 months later, and then throughout a reconditioning period. And we're looking at the level of deconditioning and developing a simple, non-invasive way of quantifying the change in curvature and low back pain that could be used for patients with low back pain on Earth, which is kind of like a key aspect of any spaceflight related research. If you want to get funding to do research in spaceflight area, spaceflight field, it has to have terrestrial health implications, which kind of makes sense. So that's one key project. The second one is basically looking at all the same things, but in a bed rest study. So up in the mountains of Slovenia next year, we're going to be looking at lumbopelvic deconditioning in people undergoing 60 days of head down tilt bed rest. So they're basically completely in the bed. Yeah, 60 days at 6-degree head down tilt, which is like the angle used to simulate fluid shifts that you get in space, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later. So these guys are paid like a lot of money to be in bed.
Who signs up for that? Yeah,
that sounds awful.
To
be
be
honest,
honest,
think you could pay me enough money for that.
I mean, when I kind of find out what they're typically paid, I was thinking about switching from the researcher team to the.
It's that good.
Yeah.
Dude, the amount of muscle you're going to lose, I mean, it's going to take a year to try and get that back, if you ever do.
There's quite a lot of deconditioning, but like in previous bed rest studies, this is going to be my first one, but in previous, my current bosses done a lot of these, and previously there wasn't a huge amount of emphasis on rehab after these studies, but now, ethically, there is a lot more time put into that as well. So we'll be looking at the effects in simulated. Bed rest is like a good analog for spaceflight. And then kind of the third area, I suppose, is relevant to us is with the BFR. So starting to explore how blood flow restriction might be useful as a countermeasure to spaceflight, which is partly because I've done BFR research. I'm also a bit of a space nerd. So combining the two, it's quite fun. So we've got up in the lab here, we've got it's called the variable gravity suspension system. So we can simulate microgravity in the same way that NASA and ESA can with their vertical treadmill facility, but we have the added benefit that we can simulate hypogravity, so different levels of low gravity. So we can currently do lunar gravity, which is about 16% body weight. We can't quite get Martian yet, which is around 30%. We need to build a new part on the suspension system, but basically we can simulate lunar loading, lunar gravity, without just using like an alter G or something that kind of unloads someone vertically. We can actually unload them from head to toe. So that's kind of the advantage of our system. So we can do lots of cool research, like looking at exercise in there, looking at fluid shifts, just general suspension. So that's kind of the key things I'm working on at the minute.
And I think that's what's interesting. Ben and I at NASA, we were talking with it, and I just need to plug you and our good friends, Kyle Hackney and Stephen Patterson. You have a really great, this is potential applications for BFR in space. And it was interesting, like you pointed out, it's always been microgravity, which is just this kind of orbital thing that we're looking at. And the space station, I guess, is still microgravity. But now we're looking at changes in gravity from a lunar to a Martian, this interplanetary plan that we have, and not only changes in gravity, but the ability to even exercise on these little ships they're going to have to go to these planets is going to be different. You can't have these giant machines like they have on the space station on the Artemis or whatever. I think that's what it's called.
Yeah. No, the space station, like the current exercise equipment. So kind of three key bits of equipment: the treadmill, the cycloergometer, are kind of the two ones that are used mainly. And then you've got the advanced resistive exercise device, which allows some forms of resistance exercise, typically multi-joint bilateral stuff. But the problem is that, well, currently the current exercise countermeasure program on the space station, it does like mitigate deconditioning to an extent, but it can't completely ameliorate it. So when astronauts come back to Earth, like they are still deconditioned, and you see them be like, pardon me, you see them be carried off like off the space shuttles. And then they undergo like ESA's rehab program is a minimum of 3 weeks. So they're pretty beat up when they come back down. So the current program isn't 100% effective, and then also it's going to be limited, as you said, Joy, like with future spacecraft like the Orion spacecraft. Like there's no way they're going to fit a treadmill in that. So basically at the moment, space agencies are looking for ways to optimize exercise countermeasures to spaceflight. So you have like your nutritional countermeasures, your pharmacological countermeasures, but exercise really is like the cornerstone countermeasure and the one that's been used for decades. It's kind of the most effective one. But the issue, as you said, is like future missions to lunar gateway, so lunar space station, lunar surface, and then onto Mars. Smaller crafts going to have less room for exercise equipment. There's going to be less capacity for vibration. So, actually causing vibration from high intensity exercise can be pretty problematic in space, because you can quite literally knock the spacecraft off course. So, that's something that needs to be minimized. And then the thing people don't often think about is the actual cost of the exercise. Like you have to remove CO2 from a very small tin can basically in space, not quite a tin can, but you have to remove CO2 and remove sweat and moisture and keep things in a really finite range. It's more so than you would in like a physiology lab. So those kind of factors are important as well, like high intensity exercise. I think there was a paper, I can't remember the exact details, but it was saying that if you're performing high intensity exercise, like the CO2 production, the sweat production, if you were to do that on the Orion spacecraft, which is planned for these missions beyond low Earth orbit, you'd be able to do like 20 minutes of exercise and have to wait 8 hours before you were able to do something again in that spacecraft. So there's tons of problems.
Yeah, I never knew that CO2 piece. Like it's 10-fold higher, I think is what you guys cited up there. And that basically you get this kind of CO2 acidosis from it, which is all sorts of problems, demineralizes bone and things like that.
Yeah, and so that, and also related to the diet as well. And Kyle Hackney did a great job of that in the paper. I think with the CO2, it's just normal levels tend to be higher on the space station than they do compared to Earth. Just it's in terms of removing CO2, it's a confined space, multiple reasons. But yeah, so like doing exercise producing more CO2 then adds to this, so it has to be removed. So like actually people think that the size of the spacecraft is the biggest barrier for everything, but specifically also exercise countermeasures, whereas actually it's maybe like the life support systems that might be the biggest issue. So that's
crazy.
In the paper, one of the things we spoke about was if BFR is low intensity and reduces these responses, then perhaps life support systems don't need to be as advanced or as work as hard or as big or as heavy, and all things which kind of factor in.
Yeah, you cited, I guess, BFR. Was that off of Alex Franz's work, maybe, that CO2 levels are less than high intensity? Like, I can honestly say I've never looked at what BFR does to CO2 levels.
To be honest, we didn't include that until after the first round of revision. So one of the reviewers pointed out that CO2 is high on the space station. So what's happening physiologically with BFR, and we touched on some of Alex Franz's work and just basically showed that how any changes are kind of rapidly return to baseline as well in terms of in the blood, because this idea of like the hypercapnia with high levels of CO2 like in the blood, astronauts get headaches and lots of other things associated with that. But we kind of just showed that the limited data we have suggests these changes are really transient, so we wouldn't imagine it would have a longer term impact on their health in that respect. But ultimately, we don't know until we try it up there.
Yeah, so I guess two things potential for BFR then is it's a space saver. Did you guys get it? Thanks. Thank you.
Ooh, boy.
You've been holding on to that one?
I enjoyed that.
I've been waiting, man. I didn't hear a word you said, Luke, because I was just thinking, when am I going to get this one? When am I going to drop this one? I get this. So yeah, but it is a kind of a gem in a box. So you have that piece, but then also the potential reduced CO2 which was a whole, we didn't get asked that question in NASA. I'm glad we didn't, because I would have been like, I don't know. But that's a whole nother piece that's pretty interesting. So I guess let's go into other problems. So we know the CO2 thing and space limitations. What about the fluid shifts?
Yeah, so that's kind of one of the first things that occurs when astronauts go up to space. The head to toe gravity vector is removed. The fluid shifts from the lower limbs towards the head. So a couple of problems arise from that. So the astronauts get swelling in the face. So they get puffy face, and then they get chicken legs, which is the scientific term that's used
Chicken
for
legs?
that. Is puffy face, chicken legged astronauts. Yeah, honestly, that terminology has been used for years, but they actually do look like that if you look at a before and after. So that
we
gives
saw
them
that, man. We saw the astronaut pictures before, the ones that are up there right now, and then we saw some pictures or videos of them on the space station. It looked like they'd gained 500 pounds. Their faces were so swollen. It was crazy. We're like, what is wrong with their heads?
the camera literally adds 10 pounds.
Yeah, space. So yeah, I mean, it is a visible shift. I mean, all that fluid goes centrally. Right.
Yeah, so up towards the head. So in terms of the head, there's the nausea, the headaches, and there's some evidence that implicating it in changes in eyesight in astronauts. But then you get, in terms of the central cardiovascular type of changes, you get a lot of the fluid moves into increase in central blood volume, increase in cardiac preload, stroke volume, cardiac output in the early, the first week or two of spaceflight, which just seem to, the data we have, just seem to level out after a while. But you don't have much blood flow or blood pooling in the lower limbs like you would on Earth. So that's hypothesized to be one of the factors that leads to astronauts experiencing orthostatic intolerance when they come back to Earth. Getting dizzy, like not just when they actually get back on Earth, on the way back in, like through re-entry as well. Lots of astronauts report the feeling of like dizziness and faintness.
Yeah, you guys put out, it's actually the hardest part of this is when they return to Earth and dealing with being back in whatever term you use for Earth gravity is actually harder than what you're dealing with in space.
Yeah, they actually adapt, like astronauts adapt quite quickly to what's happening in space. So you have the fluid shifts in the acute phase, if you call it, the first couple of weeks, and then you get your muscle atrophy, your release of bone mineral from skeletal stores, the cardiovascular deconditioning kind of occurs more chronically. And obviously, the longer you're up there, the more deconditioning you get. But actually, returning to Earth presents multiple problems because all of a sudden you've got that 1G again active from the head to toe. So we're focusing currently on the effect on the spine, lumbopelvic deconditioning, and what that means for low back pain and how difficult it is to rehab. But everything else is affected by that as well. So the muscles, the bones, and one of the biggest issues when astronauts come back, in terms of, well, I can't speak for NASA's rehab. You guys probably know more about that than me. But in terms of the European Space Agency, they have a 3-week rehab program, and it focuses predominantly on postural control first. That's one of the biggest issues astronauts have when they come back. So it's working on postural control and then starting to work on rehabbing the muscle and muscle growth, and then improving the strength and function. So kind of the postural control, sensory side of things is one of the biggest issues. And it kind of makes sense because you think as soon as they're up in space, they don't really have any sensory input. It's pretty much in space, astronauts use their legs to hook them onto a bar or something when they're doing some experimental work with their hands. So they pretty much don't use them at all. So this returning back to Earth has lots of problems.
I think it was similar. I think it was 30 days though, right, Ben? That they're in quarantine and also working on rehab, and then vestibular is their main one right off the bat, like what you're seeing over there. We saw pictures of these guys getting off the shuttle or something. I don't know, it wasn't shuttle, it was whatever. And dude, these guys look like they didn't even know how to walk. And they gave them flowers, they're holding these bouquet of flowers, I guess, welcome back to Earth. And it's these dudes are going to wipe out. Maybe give them the flowers later or put them in a vase somewhere. They need their hands right now. They got like people around them, like look like they're going to catch them while they're holding their stupid roses.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember that 1 month time frame just kept coming up for some reason as far as part of that reconditioning. But yeah, the images we saw of people coming back, they had a handler, had to have somebody on each side helping,
like hold them up.
walk them.
Yeah.
They like regress back to 1 year old. They carry.
It looks like. It's what it looks like.
Yeah.
Well, it's the chicken legs.
Yeah. I'd be in trouble if I went up there. I don't have enough volume in my legs to contribute to this central shift in fluid. So, one of the things that I really didn't have an appreciation for before talking with the folks at NASA is just the time frame for being on the space station. It's like you're up there for 6 months, potentially a year in some cases. So the idea that 3 weeks to a month is really that big of a time frame to make change after you've been up there that long just seems inadequate. And
because you said like spinal bone loss is like 1% a month, is that what it was, or a week? I forgot what it was.
Between 1% and 3% per month, depending on location. But there was
6 months of that.
There's a paper out recently which came out after we'd published this paper, or during the extremely long review process we had, which I won't get into. But this paper showed that in the astronauts that when they lost like bone mineral density, when they come back, it's still not recovered a year later. And actually, I can't remember the exact. I'll have to dig it out, but I think it was the equivalent of like 8 years or 9 years of aging in like 6 months in terms of the state of the bone compared to age match controls on Earth, which is just like insane.
Yeah, it's terrible. Well, getting back to the fluid shift, what you might know about it, Hackney's the first person turning me on to this, is the Russian rings that they used to use. Maybe they still use them. I couldn't get a clear understanding if they do or not.
The bracelet cuffs as they call them. So they're essentially like BFR cuffs. They just look a bit more medieval.
They're Russian.
There's no contoured cuffs up there. So no limb protection sleeves, nothing. But they started experimenting like in the 1990s, and most of the data was from the Mir spaceflight missions, and they just started using them to. The idea was to kind of prevent fluids from shifting from the lower limbs toward the head in the first few days of spaceflight, and encourage like venous blood pooling. And there's very limited data, but we covered it briefly in the paper. But the data suggests that it was partially effective in helping prevent or mitigate some of the changes, orthostatic changes, cardiovascular changes during spaceflight and when they return to Earth. And like NASA have gone one step further in recent years, and like with lower body negative pressure. And I know Kyle Hackney's published on that previously, I think a few years back. So we kind of proposed that BFR could potentially be used in those early days. Like kind of like a passive protocol that we use for like mitigating atrophy or recovery, just doing something where it could be on the astronaut while they're doing other things. And that's actually one of the key things of the space age is like time. Like astronauts' time is very expensive. Like it's something like £20,000, $20,000 for 10 minutes of an astronaut's time for an experiment. Like it's really expensive. So any way to minimize time is key. So if you could do an intervention like that they could have on their legs while they're doing something else with their hands, it could be like really beneficial to the wider context of the mission, not just for the primary purpose of mitigating the fluid shift.
Yeah. And some of the NASA scientists, we had calls with them. I think they got them. They were getting Delphi cuffs, and they were just going to try and apply them up there for venous occlusion, just intermittently throughout the time. Very low profile way to do it. I mean, basically you need like 50 millimeters of mercury on and off, trying to control that. So looks like they're trying to do that next step.
Nice. Yeah. Well, it was all kind of the Russian data is all low pressures. You don't need. They said high pressure.
You don't need
so
much.
40, 50 millimeters of mercury, you probably forget it was on very quickly. It's not much at all. So
It's our sham protocols everyone uses, basically.
Yeah.
What not only astronauts' time, the amount of freaking time it takes an astronaut to get up there is crazy. Because we had a couple of astronauts with us. They were astronauts in training. And we're like, when do you think you're gonna get up there? He's like, man, I hope in about 5 to 7 years. That's our average.
Did you have the ASCANs, I think they're called, the astronaut candidates? Scott Kelly's book, and he was talking about his time as an Afghan. And 2 years 2 years general training, and then you have to wait to be selected for a mission.
I know. It's like, what do you do then for like 7 years? Just kind of moping around, working out a little bit, waiting.
Well, they train, don't they? When you get like 2 years of training just for a specific mission, at least the European astronauts go through that, and like and just general, like they have to do so much like media and outreach and
and they have like a full-on like space station in the water where they practice. I mean, parts of it where they go in the water and just act like they're in space. It's pretty crazy.
That's why we need some waterproof BFR cuffs.
No, there we go.
Just put them inside the suit. Surely those spacesuits are waterproof.
Yeah, it should be.
Good thought, actually. Yeah.
This is just what we need is more ways for people to misuse BFR.
Yeah.
That's exactly what all of us are wishing for.
This is the social media approach, right? Just put it on all 4 limbs because it's systemic, and then we're there.
We can try it out when you guys come over. We'll get a couple of wetsuits, go to the Welsh coast, get the cuffs on underneath, and get in the sea.
You guys can do that. I'm gonna drink the
Welsh coast is cold.
Yeah, is that before or after the Welsh whiskey? And so
I'm just drinking it the whole time.
Maybe after, so keep it a bit warm. We'll see.
So fluid shifts a problem, bone obviously a problem, and then I guess the other key piece, which is the is muscle, right? Anything different that happens in space with muscle? I mean, I think you noted like muscle protein breakdown starts to really rise. Is there something weird with space that we don't see with just non-weight bearing on Earth?
Well, I suppose in general, space is considered like space flight is an analog for disuse and immobilization and aging on Earth, and also disuse, immobilization, and aging on Earth are an analog for what happens in space flight. So similarly, when we have the reduced mechanical loading and reduced neuromuscular use, not sensory input, etc., you don't have to control the legs, and we get the atrophy, we get decrease in muscle protein synthesis like we see with disuse, and then also increased breakdown rates, potentially more than what we would see on Earth. I don't really know why, if I'm completely honest, but that culminates in a negative impact on muscle protein balance, and then you get the atrophy. And then there's more and more data now coming out on me, including some of these key papers in the paper, showing that actually satellite cell content and myonuclear number decreases in space and quite rapidly, and which is believed to contribute to atrophy. But then also another issue is when they come back to Earth, it's like, do they have a reduced regenerative capacity because of this lower satellite cell content within the muscle? So the atrophy is always going to be like an issue. It's going to be hard to completely mitigate that. Even in hypergravity, like on the moon, it's still not 1G, and ultimately humans adapted or evolved in 1G. So that seems to be a key issue. So I suppose the processes mirror what happens on Earth. It just seems to happen a lot quicker in space, in terms of like if you compare it to aging and sarcopenia, for example.
Because it seems like BFR could be such a way in these long conditions to just add so much volume with so little downside. Maybe less CO2. I mean, whatever on that piece, but they're not having to go through, because you put on it like they do 2.5 hours a day of like strength training and aerobic exercise. And you see someone like Jacob Nielsen's study, it's like if you do BFR twice a day for 3 weeks, you've really upregulated the satellite cell and increased fiber size. Because it's BFR, we know you can get pretty good hypertrophy, and there's this whole strength versus hypertrophy kind of debate, but it sounds like muscle loss is really what you got to go at. You're not worried about strength as much. I mean, obviously that's a big deal, but you really want to maintain muscle mass.
Yeah, the muscle mass seems to be the kind of key issue, and like what a lot of the like space medicine team at ESA, for example, are quite focused on. But yeah, I think like the 2.5 hours per day, so that includes like time to set up for exercise, do the exercise, and then break down, as they call it, and then personal hygiene. But they're still doing about 45 minutes of resistance exercise and 45 minutes of aerobic exercise per day, 6 days a week. So wow. that's a hell of a lot. It's still not able to.
It's still not enough
to mitigate. Yeah, exactly. So I think, you know, in terms of time, a few things we proposed in that paper were related to. We kind of built off kind of a pioneering paper from the European Space Agency's space medicine team. So like John Scott, Toby Werber, and Dave Green did a special topic in Frontiers where it was focused on optimization of exercise countermeasures to spaceflight, and they had different groups submit papers. There was actually another BFR one in there, but they in the kind of overall paper which introduced the topic, they identified a couple of ways that we could potentially optimize countermeasures to spaceflight. So one of which was called combined training. So they want to look at forms of training that can impact multiple physiological systems. And obviously we know from BFR using like a growth restriction with aerobic exercise, for example, we not only can we get aerobic adaptation, we can get muscular adaptation, potentially bone adaptation as well, potentially tendon, we don't know yet. But, you know, so that's one of the ways we propose that BFR were really beneficial, because you can do one type of exercise and potentially impact all of these systems. But more specifically in relation to your question, Johnny, or your point, is that they spend a lot of time exercising, and one of the other strategies they identified was more efficient training, whereby we could reduce the time without reducing the efficacy. And we cited and described that classic Abe paper where they did low intensity cycle training, 40% VO2 max, I think it was, 45 minutes versus the same for 15 minutes with 15. BFR. And yeah, and the improvements in muscle size and strength, and I think VO2 max and time to exhaustion, if I remember correctly, and like just showing that, you know, a third of the volume in terms of actual time prescribed was able to not only produce comparable adaptations but greater. So that's another way we've proposed that BFR could be beneficial. It's like maybe we don't have to do as much, so you have less time for exercise and more time for other mission related tasks as well. So, and then like with the BFR exercise protocol, you know, we're getting all these benefits simultaneously, we think. Especially, I think aerobic exercise could be the way to go with all this different impact. I think I'm getting more and more interested in the aerobic side of things as the research
they always do well. I'm like, you want a good BFR study, just do aerobic. It always seems to work. But you couldn't get it on the small one, right? You wouldn't have a bike or a treadmill if you're going to Mars.
Yeah, so you'd need potentially you'd have something small. There's like, you can get like the kind of, they're used in rehab over here. I'm assuming they're used on your side of the pond as well. The small kind of arm ergometers or leg ergometers where you can literally put them on the end of a patient's bed for someone who is bedridden. So like that Sunberg paper, you know, the one with the localized change and like people lying reclining
on their back.
That type. Yeah, so there's those kind of options, but I think
I didn't think
ultimately anything that reduces time can impact multiple physiological systems and is low load. Like a big problem for future spacecraft, well, these devices have to have like a vibration isolation system. So, you know, if high intensity exercise may not be possible or feasible in these spacecraft. So, you know, it also depends on, I suppose, the context of the mission. Like if we're thinking about Lunar Gateway, returning back to the Lunar Space Station, the early missions are probably going to be a couple of weeks, 3-4 weeks at a time. We're probably not going to see a huge amount of physiological deconditioning to the point where they're debilitated when they return to Earth. The problem will arise is when they're spending time on a lunar space station, spending time on a lunar surface, and then like a Mars mission is going to take 3 years. Like we don't even know if they'd survive that physiologically. Wow. Like space risks aside, back from the space station after 6 months and they're absolutely ruined. How are they going to cope with 3 years?
Well, from what you've said so far, it kind of sounds like they just come back looking like what we think those Martians look like, with the big old heads and bulging eyes and stuff.
Skinny legs.
Sounds like and skinny legs.
Taller.
Just like, it's just like
They look like Ben.
They look like already.
I mean, I could be a model for y'all's, projects moving forward. Skinny legs, big head. I'm in.
Hey, you guys be nice to Ben. It's his work anniversary today. It's yesterday.
Oh, really?
Today's Ben's work anniversary.
Ben's day. Yeah.
How
many years, Ben?
So we have
7 years in.
7 years.
We have to be nice to Ben today.
Yeah.
Happy anniversary, Ben.
Oh, thanks. I feel special.
You don't get anything till 10. That's when you get like whatever it is, China or something.
So, Luke, and I'm sure this is something that we're planning to address, but it popped in my head as one of the things that I remember us talking about when we went to Houston is, one of the major things they were concerned about and trying to figure out ways to cope with was just the kind of vascular degradation for that time in space flight. You talked about them coming back looking older. I mean, they were talking about some of these astronauts coming back almost looking like they're an older person with some peripheral vascular disease when they come home. And so, that really also kind of piques my interest with potential applications for BFR, even if it's just the wear cuffs and do intermittent venous occlusion or something like that to get just the intermittent hypoxia for VEGF for some sort of maintenance of vascular structure along with what you're doing to the other lean mass.
Yeah, it's really interesting point, Ben. I think ultimately what's kind of happening probably on a smaller scale in the astronauts is what you get with patients with peripheral arterial disease here on Earth. And there's actually a guy over here in the UK that I'm working with looking at using BFR and IPC in these types of patients. And we're looking at targeting, he's a vascular surgeon, we're looking at targeting end stage patients where their next option is amputation, and looking at can we do an acute, they can barely tolerate walking from the car park into the hospital. So it's like, can we do acute intervention to kind of pull them back from that cliff edge, so to speak? But I feel like the benefits would be the same in space. It's like creating that local, because if you think that we're saying you remove, there's no axial loading, so no head to toe loading, but there's no sensory input to the legs really. They might hook them onto something so they can do some of their arms, but they're not using their legs. They pretty much, if you look at videos of astronauts, they pretty much use their arms to move around and navigate and even propel themselves one side of the space station to another. So they just don't use those legs. So there's like minimal physiological stress peripherally. So I feel like that would be, whether it's using it with exercise or as you said, passively, intermittently, I feel like it would be kind of a really good area to explore.
We know that the hypothesis is there, or the pathway for just hypoxia and increase in angiogenesis of VEGF, HIF1A, whatever. Do you guys know, is there a paper that's done that and shown that? I've only seen it always with exercise.
I mean, Luke, I don't know if you're on. I know Stephen has an IPC and vascular change paper, just a passive application of tourniquet for 2 weeks. I don't remember the actual frequency of IPC application, but seeing some improvements in blood flow. I mean, I don't know if it's a true angiogenesis or just a neurospectrometry blood flow or reactive hyperemia kind of response.
That was during my time at St. Mary's. I took part in that study.
That's the 7 days ischemic preconditioning one, right? It basically mimics high altitude kind of. That one? Is that the one you're talking about, Ben?
Yes, I think so. Would have to go back.
It was daily, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
7 days of IPC.
Be interesting
and it
to
showed
that.
changes.
And then actually,
okay,
it was muscle VO2 if I remember correctly, because I can remember that horrible E-stim complex on the calf during that measurement.
E-stim on the calf sounds terrible.
Oh man, it was brutal. So you have the Hulkinson cuff. Stephen, if you're listening to this, I'm still bitter about it. But that Hulkinson cuff, the rapid inflation above the knee, going to 300 millimeters of mercury in like half a second.
Yeah, it pumps fast.
And then stim the calf like just before to like increase metabolism, metabolic rate in the calf, and then bang this cuff on. It's just I hated that damn study. I like ethically, I had no choice to take back. Steve was my boss, so I had to do it. But yeah, it's a cool paper. But I think it'd be really interesting to revisit that in more of a spaceflight context, and then actually, look at individualized pressures and 100, 120% LLP, and just like things have kind of developed a bit since then. But the problem with doing those type of studies on Earth is, like, our suspension system, yes, we can unload someone, but we can't leave them in there for a week. I mean, we could, but we're not allowed to, and they're not going to sign up for that. So, you'd need a bed rest study. You'd need or one thing that is going to be available in the near future from the European Space Agency, at least, is these dry immersion type studies where people are like on a waterbed. So they're actually like, they're not touching the water, but they're basically floating on water. And the idea is that you can get these changes you get with bed rest are accelerated rapidly when they're kind of buoyant on water. So yeah, so these studies might be 2 weeks. So that's
terrible.
a potential option in the future.
Yeah. Steven's an asshole. Not only did that study, then he's got the making people do 100 box jumps. He's done twice, Steven, you need to chill out, bro.
He's got the happiest dog in the world, though, man. He does all that to people at work, and he just goes home and the dog's happy because he's
like, I'll be in Ireland.
My baseball coach used to joke how his dog would run after a ball game that we lost because he didn't want to get kicked. But Steven's dog is happy.
Takes it out on others. And that was a big thing when we wrapped up our day with NASA was, what's the safety profile with this? These are high value targets, $20,000 an hour or whatever you said it was. These astronauts are a big effing deal. Any other things you're concerned with from a safety side? And I know you're speaking at their conference here coming up. So what do you think, Luke? The big thing really was the vascular side for them.
Yeah, that's something that came up when we spoke with them previously. I mean, hopefully we did a good enough job of covering this in the paper, but like one thing that is a concern in space is like increased risk of DVT. And there was recently, within the last 5 years, reports of thrombus in astronauts, and they have medication and stuff up there to deal with that. But based on data in 1G or Earth-based data, I'm not aware of any paper out there that shows BFR directly causing an increased risk of a DVT or of a clot. And that's one thing we say with the causes of different things. There's no robust evidence, and actually some data suggests it might be the other case with stimulation of the fibrinolytic system. So I feel like, yes, it will be important to measure in terms of doing some acute studies, taking these measures again within a spaceflight analog and on the space station where possible. But based on the data on it, I can't see there being an increased risk of clotting as a result of BFR. It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, and you're going to have the DVT risk because you're going to have stasis in outer space,
even
especially
in the carotids,
in the lower extremities. You're going to have stasis for sure.
Yeah.
So, which is interesting to me. I feel like recently everything kind of keeps going back to blood flow. What can we do to kind of enhance blood flow? Johnny and I were just chatting the other day after you had done ACL study day, and we had Chris Fry on there. And I was telling him, I feel like kind of it's something that Stephen had hypothesized years ago at CSM was, we have these papers that are BFR papers that basically are just inflate, deflate, but they're looking at muscle atrophy, loss of strength, those sorts of things. And they're assigning a cause to that being this like swelling response, this idea that hypoxia causes this swelling, and then that in turn kind of keeps that muscle a little bit healthier, a little bit better able to produce force and stay around. But Stephen had said, nobody's really talked about the blood flow side, and I kind of wonder, like, as closely as those satellite cells are tied to the capillary beds, when we see kind of this shifting away from type 1 fiber to type 2X fiber, people are getting more anaerobic You guys talking about the VO2 max side of things, the peripheral vascular kind of disease presentation. It just feels like, anything we can do to kind of normalize blood flow in outer space or in potentially maybe a disuse or a relative disuse scenario on Earth would be
Kyle,
a really positive
we
thing.
We don't call it Earth on this podcast. We call it terrestrial.
Oh, terrestrial. Terrestrial.
Kyle, it's a really
Excuse me.
interesting.
Yeah.
I think you've really interesting point, Kyle. I mean, ultimately, if you strip it back, anything that the muscle needs or wants or gets delivered to the muscle gets there via the blood. We try and look at it as simply as that. So,
and that's where I thought,
blood supply.
when you were talking about just countermeasures, in my head, I was kind of going, it seems like maybe, actually like aerobic exercise might make a bit more of an impact in outer space with BFR than maybe resistance exercise, just kind of thinking about it from that perspective. Because in my head, I'm like, okay, what can we do to like get the heart pumping and push blood around to the area? And then, can we kind of enhance that maybe with the addition of BFR? Makes me wonder too, we've had conversations recently with Todd Davenport and Larry Cahalan about these devices that basically kind of help the preload of the heart in people that have heart failure, where they basically time this contraction of like a tourniquet almost type system, but it's the whole leg. They time it with kind of this ventricular filling.
The left ventricle.
Force blood, exactly. Force blood into the heart through this really rapid inflation of these cuffed kind of systems. And it makes me wonder, like, something like that, but maybe in reverse that would force blood actually distally might make some sense too. I'm just like, my head's kind of going all sort of different directions right now. I'm just thinking about what might actually be important and, where things could go in the future. So anyway.
Well, you talked to Larry, like his reason why he was so excited to get into BFR research was the muscle hypothesis for the heart, but also stroke volume. I mean, he's just like, dude, this stroke volume thing can be huge. But I do the vascular side with BFR is going to be the future. I mean, there's so much potential.
Seems like it.
I mean, you like even listen to Jeremy nowadays. I mean, he's really like stoked about potential of the vascular side, and because you can maybe do it without exercise. That's sweet.
Or super easy exercise.
Yeah, super easy. Right. You just need. I think we're going to be at the point though. It's like it's got to be high pressure, or 100% pressure.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, thinking through the potential of that, I've always wondered if the kind of steady state, longer duration inflation, more time under hypoxia, if the hypoxia is really linked to this HIF-1A VEGF release, is that better, or would it be better to do something more intermittent? Like, Luke, almost like what you guys did for your pain study, is that kind of retrograde, antegrade shear stress component driving some of this VEGF release and adaptation,
I just kind of wonder, like, what is the natural state of skeletal muscle in these scenarios? Like, I don't know that we even know that. Like, it would actually kind of make sense that potentially in muscle already you have HIF-1A present because there's a relative amount of hypoxia due to the fact that they're just not using muscle as much. I mean, we know that normoxia is what breaks down HIF-1A, so there's potential that maybe this muscle actually already has kind of these high levels of that. And it actually needs like the physical kind of stress potentially on that tissue too. So, because shear stress, we know kind of plays a role there and all that. So
the hypoxia is going to be a really important factor with the spaceflight research going forward. Like the future spacecraft, it's thought and hypothesized it's going to be, conditions are going to be hypoxic to an extent. So, as an example, the bed rest study we're taking part in next year, and in that particular study, while we're looking at lumbopelvic deconditioning, the purpose of the study is to look at countermeasures to mitigate the deconditioning. And there's like 12 different investigator teams, just people looking at bone, muscle, we're looking at spine, there's people looking at fluid shifts. So it's one huge study, but the participants will be under hypoxia, and the artificial gravity countermeasure, along with some exercise involved during artificial gravity, is going to be done under hypoxia, and future spacecraft will be, people will be under conditions of hypoxia. And one thing that kind of going back to your point, Carl, or Ben's point about the blood flow and the retrograde shear and different things. One thing to, if we're doing aerobic exercise in space, or even just resistance exercise or BFR in space, we don't know the magnitude of like reactive hyperemia and reperfusion, because we don't have that 1G stimulus helping promote that as well.
Right.
So is it going to be, that's another question we need to look at, is it going to be as intense, I suppose?
Yeah, you'd imagine it wouldn't be,
right?
It just shoots right back to the heart instead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
Well,
so there's tons to
I know
answer.
you got a bone paper coming out. So just, we probably talked about it a ton on this podcast, but some of the mechanisms you want to just kind of briefly touch on, or why you think BFR could help an astronaut with bone.
Yeah, so it's kind of the paper, which hopefully be out in the next few months. But essentially, the purpose of the paper is to build on kind of the acute and chronic papers looking at the effect of BFR on bone metabolism, which predominantly have looked at bone biomarkers, so markers of bone modeling and remodeling processes. And then obviously we had the paper from Corbin and his crew looking at the bone mineral density and stuff like various else. So the purpose of the paper is to say, look, here's BFR, here's some acute evidence, and now there's this pioneering paper that suggests it might actually improve bone health objective measures. Here's why it's important, and here's how we should do it properly. So we think about how bone normally adapts, or what's thought to be the primary stimulus. It's like the high impact, high loaded, multi-directional, unaccustomed loads, like your jumping, your plyometrics, your resistance-based stuff, and anything that's like, habitual, accustomed loading, repetitive, low intensity, like your cycling, isn't thought to be a primary stimulus.
Bone's like, nah, this is boring.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the
but
intense
I think
stuff.
it's
Bone's an adrenaline junkie.
But like, it's not just like, although mechanical loading is like widely thought of as the primary stimulus, primary autogenic stimulus, bone also responds to a lot of metabolic changes. So alterations in pH, alterations in calcium availability within the blood, multiple things. Some actually bone responds to some factors released into the blood from the skeletal muscle itself. It responds to growth hormone, VEGF, all these kind of changes we see with BFR. So yes, BFR is inherently low load, so that the loading, the high impact, multi-directional and accustomed to load isn't there, but the metabolic stress is there, and then some. So if it's if we're getting the hypoxia, HIF1 alpha, upregulation of VEGF, improved blood supply, increasing growth hormone, all these different factors, that's how we think, and we propose in this paper, BFR might impact bone predominantly through those pathways. So in an astronaut in space, or even let's say on the moon when they're at 16% body weight, it's going to be hard to load them to the intensity that typically thought to be required for bone adaptation. But if we can stimulate the bone, the local bone tissue, through these metabolic changes, then that might be beneficial to stimulate adaptation in that way, in the absence of the high mechanical load.
Yeah, I think combining Corbin's paper and Lambert's with that Bullet paper, I just think is awesome. Heavy and BFR did basically the exact same thing for bone. Low load did nothing in that. So
the kind of the idea for this paper with Chris Sentner from over in Germany, we've done it together. The idea is to kind of set out a methodological framework for any BFR bone related studies going forward. So
perfect.
Yes, if you look at acute changes, you've only got your bone biomarkers. You're not going to see changes on a DEXA scan, but changes in bone density acutely. So they're the chronic measures. So the bone biomarkers can give us an indication of what's happening to the bone acutely. But actually, if you look at the general bone literature and what thought of as defined as optimal in terms of the biomarkers you select, the time course of when they should be assessed, how the studies should be controlled, the BFR evidence is really poor in that respect, in terms of, yes, it might have included some of the key biomarkers, but actually the time points where it's been measured in BFR exercise and maybe shown no change is because that particular biomarker is known to peak within the first 50 minutes after exercise and then return to baseline. And then a BFR study, for example, acutely may have measured it at 40 minutes post and reported no change. Doesn't mean that there's been no change. It means that you've measured it the wrong time.
You missed it.
There's so many factors. Yeah, I was actually surprised, like in terms of how much control and how many confounding factors there is to like acute and chronic bone metabolism, but more so acute. So hopefully this paper gives us a bit of a framework to do this stuff and kind of optimize and look at those mechanisms, look at VEGF.
I think it's important right now that we kind of acknowledge and highlight, if you will, this fact that we think there's definitely some potential for BFR to impact bone in a very positive way. We have absolutely no clue what are the best parameters to even begin to elicit a response. We have no clue if it will help heal bone that's injured. We definitely have thoughts, and we think that there's some potential there, and we're happy to kind of conjecture on how to sort of build a program, but we don't know a minimal dose response. We don't know optimal. There's like, it's just this big mush of, we don't know. But here's how you could maybe program exercise to really optimally kind of stimulate skeletal muscle and do these other things. And that probably has some really
way to be a freaking party pooper, dude.
Well, hey man, like there's already a Con Ed piece out there telling people how BFR heals fractured bone, and it doesn't cite one single human study. So I don't want people walking away from our podcast thinking that they just slap a cuff on and do 20 minutes of exercise and BFR is going to fix their bone problem. Like that's not a thing. There's a whole lot of layers to this bone piece that we just don't know.
And even if none of that works, bone loves muscle.
Yeah.
So if you're losing muscle, it goes south. If you're giving it muscle, it's happy. There's a crosstalk.
Yeah. That's typically the talking point that I take is, since we don't really have the data on bone, let's stick to what we know, which is the muscle. And how the hell are you going to control for a study on fractures and really have enough, of a similar
model,
population to compare?
You got to go with the animal model.
And people don't like animal models, even though it's the only place where we can actually control variables.
Well,
can't.
The only way you can really do, sorry, Johnny, go on.
No, you go ahead, Luke. I talked to
the only way we can really do these studies is, like as Kyle said, we have no idea what's optimal minimal dose. Is like all these controlling for like circadian rhythms, nutritional status, sex, genetics, all these factors that I've learned recently influence bone metabolism and how the bone responds to acute and chronic exercises. We have to control for all of these and then do a parabolic type study where we say, right, here's a 14, 16, 18, 20 week program, and we're going to compare directly to high intensity. We're going to have low intensity with BFR at 80% LLP, and have it 40%, 20%, whatever, then a low intensity alone in a control group. Measure all these mechanisms, these changes in VEGF, and then have a look at the objective measures, the DEXA scans, and assessing it that way. And then that's going to be the starting point where we see something there, we can think, But one thing I always point out to people with the BFR, especially like when I talk about pain, for example, or we discuss how it might or hypothesize how BFR might have an effect on bone, as Carl said, we don't have any objective data yet. The first real piece of objective data is the study from Coben and Lambert really out there, but it's that we haven't got a specific BFR and bone protocol. We haven't got a specific BFR and pain protocol. We haven't got a specific BFR and vascular adaptation protocol. The same protocols we're using, the same protocols we're using are impacting all these systems. So again, like if you're putting the cuff on to rehab a muscle injury, but there's also a bone injury, and you're doing the 30, 15, 15, you're doing your LOP 80%, your 30-second rest, you might be impacting multiple physiological systems, which would be great if so, but ultimately you've usually got one goal for doing that. So anything else is like an added benefit. And at present, we know BFR exercise causes hypogeusia, and we started to identify some of the mechanisms in my previous postdoc, but we know so little about it. And like that wasn't a specific pain protocol. It was just your standard BFR, what we think is optimal at the moment, but we actually don't know if that's optimal.
Right. Well, like Jeremy said, it might be it's just a simple change of pressure. Like I got a vascular patient. Okay, we know this is the pressure we need to use, type of thing, which will be so cool if we get to that point.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like dialing in medicine there. So we just need some trials.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think one of the biggest questions, and this came up in the ACL study day with Kyle and Chris Fry, is like, what's the minimal dose? I feel like we're driving so much towards working out what's optimal, myself included. But recently I thought, come on, take a step back. What's the minimal dose? Like, what is the bare minimum we can get away with? And that's not just from being lazy. It's more of you might have some individuals, some populations who are so deconditioned, they can't do anything at all. It's like, what's the minimum we can do to have an acute benefit that day one, then do it again day two and increase. And then, similarly for astronauts, yes, they're not as deconditioned and low compromised and debilitated, but they're constrained in terms of time and equipment. So what's the absolute bare minimum we can get away with to mitigate changes? I feel like that's another really important, besides the BFR research that hasn't seemed to be explored really yet.
And the added layer to that is that probably involves not only some parameters on the BFR side of things, but also an assessment of the individual to see what their training status is, because depending on your training status, your minimal dose is going to be different as well. So, do we have an ability to actually kind of like, for example, I'm thinking along the lines of like an older person where we've talked with Dr. Fry about, the lack of blood flow in the muscle, and that kind of being this sort of mediating principle as to whether or not we can get adaptation. Well, some older people have good blood flow in their muscle, some don't. So how do we determine like who's who, and how do we best prescribe exercise for that specific individual? There's
but then
so
that's
much
going to be so cool if it's like, okay, we're going to do the vascular protocol to get your baseline blood, for this first month, and then we're flipping to the strength and hypertrophy protocol, and we're just changing whatever parameter needs to be changed.
Right. How do we make that decision? Is kind of the question. Yeah.
One thing that I would love to do, given the time, and me and Stephen spoke about this a couple of times, is to revisit Jeremy's meta-analysis 2012, looking at like what was optimal load, optimal rest period, and then just go, because it probably hasn't changed too much, but there could be some additional like key talking points from that. But I feel like, so we start exploring loads and rest periods and durations and all of that.
Continuous inflation versus intermittent.
We could be way off what's optimal at the moment for all we know. So
right. That's absolutely.
That is crazy. That is a 10-year-old paper. I didn't even think about it. I mean, think how many new studies. I mean, even studies that are personalized now using LLP. That wasn't even looked at because we didn't really have that data. So, Luke, one of the other questions they had for us was, what does this do for the hematopoietics, specifically platelets? So can you touch base on kind of what happens to the blood, for an astronaut, and especially when they get back to 1G, and how BFR might help?
Yeah, so in terms of our paper, that was actually Kyle's expertise, which mostly covered that section. But what
Kyle Hackney, not this Kyle.
By the way.
I've appreciated you saying his name every time, because I'm like, wait, no, this isn't me. Okay,
you could just say smart Kyle.
Smart. Okay, yeah, here we go.
Well, he is really smart. I mean, he's smart. He's smarter than me. Smarter than all of us.
Luke, yesterday was my day. Yesterday was National Kyle Day, so today
really
John
was.
gets to pick on me. Yeah.
Was it your work anniversary as well, or was this some?
No, it was just National Kyle Day. I'll send you the text message. I forgot to send it to you yesterday.
He just found some obscure website that had it listed as National Kyle Day yesterday. Which
I didn't find it. My friend
it happened to coincide.
He was celebrating me yesterday,
and he sent it out to all of our staff, and all he got was a bunch of eye rolls from all of us. So it wasn't a great day.
Chris supported me.
Our computer guys supported him.
Computer guys supported me. Everybody
y'all have a bromance, anyways. So
yeah, I like Chris. He's my new bestie.
But yeah, sorry. Back to Kyle Hackney, not National Kyle. So basically, there's again limited data, which tends to be the story with astronauts.
Yeah.
But suggesting that a lot of the astronauts have hematopoietic, pronounce it correctly, disorders and like altered responses when they return to Earth. So changes in blood cell mass and obviously changes in blood flow, which we discussed. And it has been linked to hematopoietic stem progenitor cells, so HSPCs, as Cal Hackney likes to call them. So he's done a couple of papers now, I think, on that, looking at the role of hypoxia in upregulation of these cells. So if I'm completely honest with you, in terms of my understanding of exactly what happens in the spaceflight context to these when they return to Earth is limited, because we have limited data to draw upon for that. But what has been documented in these astronauts is they do have changes in plasma and whole blood volume and changes in the mass of different blood cells, which tends to make them more predisposed or present with symptoms of these disorders, whether they've actually developed the disorders or not, or it's just they've just acutely developed the symptoms. We don't know yet.
Do they give them whole blood when they get back? Are they getting things like that that you know of?
I don't know, to be honest. I'm not sure. I don't know if the NASA guy said anything to you. I mean, I've not come across or read anything related to that. But I suppose, if a 3-year mission to Mars, they're going to have some frozen blood, I'm assuming, because
I think so.
An injury and loss of blood.
Yeah,
never mind the actual changes to blood cells. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if they're given any blood on their return. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, it's down. That they said that's a big deal, is trying to get platelet and just blood volume up in the post reconditioning phase. So yeah, Kyle did show ACE2 was up, the progenitor cells were up. That paper we did with the Andrews guys, an acute bout of BFR, platelet count was significantly up, and the progenitor cells. So it seems like those are just acute studies. All of those.
Do you think that's like hypoxia mediated? Because those papers I find like extremely interesting, and that's like an area of BFR or area of like blood physiology where I'm kind of like, whoa, what's this is like pretty technical mechanistic stuff. And do you think that's how is BFR having such an immediate acute effect on these platelets, for example, which are usually only called upon in the event of needing form a clot?
Yeah, I know. I'm not sure, but I don't think it's volume related, because the Andrews ones, they really wanted to hedge their bets. So they did 4 exercises bilateral and showed this kind of decent increase that went away. And then, but Kyle and them, they just did 10% 1RM, like a leg extension, like basically, I think it was a Biodex, and found the same thing. So that's really low volume. And found it. So it might be like, it's more of a hypoxia thing.
In the Hackney paper, did they look at platelets, or was it just the CD34 positives?
CD34 and ACE, yeah.
Yeah, because what was interesting too about the Andrews paper is the timing of the platelet increase. On the multiple times that they looked at it, it was really just like immediately after deflation, it was significantly up, and then 30 minutes later, whatever the next time point was, it was not elevated anymore.
Yeah, don't know, but it was an antecubital blood draw, and they did the leg exercises. So it wasn't like they trapped platelets and drew it out of the popliteal vein or something. It was a systemic.
It's like stripping it back, I suppose. Like it's just another example of how, like what we were saying from the paper, the HSPCs just don't behave as they normally do when they're in space, and acutely when they return to Earth. I don't know how long that lasts when they return to Earth, but in terms of like cell differentiation, proliferation, like those things just don't work as normal. And BFR might be a way to potentially kickstart that physiology again. And I suppose that's kind of what we're talking about when we're saying about how the muscle behaves, satellite cells, muscle points, and the vasculature. It's kind of, suppose if we had to put an umbrella term on it all, of how BFR might be impacting the physiology side of things for getting the operational benefits. Like, it's just kickstarting things that aren't being used as much as they normally would be in terrestrial or 1G on Earth.
If
Good job. Good job.
Yeah, good job. Keeping it astronauty here. If you were to have the European Space Agency come and they say, Luke, you get to do one thing with BFR. It can be preconditioning, it can be reconditioning, it can be in space. Where do you think we should start?
I mean, ultimately, astronauts are pretty fit individuals.
Yeah, they are.
They exercise is mandated as part of their job. I actually recently thought that all astronauts love exercising. So I spoke with the NASA crew, and it's just mandated and part of their job. But I think in terms of preconditioning, they're already in a pretty damn good condition when they go up there, because they know, we know the amount of deconditioning they're going to be exposed to or should present with, and they also have to be fit to be able to perform their mission safely and effectively. So probably wouldn't start with preconditioning. I'd be really interested to probably be during spaceflight or recondition. I think if you could, probably I would go for during, because if you could show BFR potentially if it was more effective as a countermeasure during spaceflight, then if they come back in a better condition or less deconditioned, then surely the reconditioning isn't going to need to be as thorough, or they're not going to need as much reconditioning. It might be a shorter time frame, because I suppose it's like similar to like pre-op and before surgery. The idea is that we can put them in a better position after surgery. So I would go for the during spaceflight, and I would get them jumping with BFR, which we have been looking at in the suspension system. But we do have just analyzed and just written up. We're just kind of finishing putting it together, but we have done an initial study in the suspension system here. So we've looked at just simply automatically measuring LLP using the Delphi PTS, and looking at, so we've looked at bed rest conditions, which are analogs for spaceflight, and then we've suspended participants in the suspension system. So we've done offloaded them simulated microgravity, so no head to toe loading. Then we've done the same at 6-degree head down tilt, which mimics the fluid shift. Like you get congestion in the head within like a minute. It's crazy. And then we've also done 9.5-degree up tilt, which simulates lunar gravity. And the idea was that before we do anything with BFR in a spaceflight context, we need to be sure that the gold standard measurement we use for it to be safe and effective works, and how it might be different and might be affected. And kind of building upon one of my PhD studies, will be looking at the effect of body position, and the SealJax paper did the same as well, where they compared supine and upright. And we've actually found that LLP if there is a difference in LLP. So for example, if you had someone in 9.5-degree head up tilt on a bed, which is the angle used to simulate lunar gravity, and then you put them in 9.5-degree head up tilt, but without loading in a suspension system, LLP is different. And there's differences in some other conditions we've included as well, without going into too much detail and boring everyone. But essentially, what we think is going to be the conclusion is that, well, you can't measure LLP pre-flight on Earth and then prescribe BFR exercise relative to that, because there's going to be a difference in LLP. Therefore, 80% is going to be different. And then actually, if you take it one step further, so we need to basically measure it in space. And that's not just my way of getting the space agencies to allow me to send a device up or go up, preferably. But if you think about the changes in space with the atrophy, the changes in blood flow, LLP is going to change over time.
Yeah,
probably.
quickly.
That would quickly as well. Yeah. So you need to be able to measure up there. So we've shown that you can conduct a measurement in simulated microgravity and hypergravity, and we've shown that it's reliable test retest, which we would expect based on the data we have in 1G. So the next step would be to look at that in actual microgravity. And I think once we know it can be prescribed, then we can really start exploring its use. And I think one of the key areas we're looking at, we've had the ethics for the study, but we're going to go straight in with some plyometric type jumping exercise with BFR. That's something that discussed with European Space Agency, and there's going to be a little collaboration going on with that. So that's something they're really interested in at the minute. Space Agency is jumping into space, potential for impact on muscle and bone, and it being quick. So we want to look at, can BFR make high intensity jumping more effective, or can it can it be implemented during submaximal hopping and then potentially make the the acute response greater, similar to like what we typically do with BFR? Can we reduce the exercise intensity and put the cuff on to increase the response? So there's a couple of ways we're gonna look at that, which hopefully will lead to some.
And that's not too much vibration.
This is one of the concerns for the study. So I think we're gonna not so much for us, and we can jump in our suspension system for the health and safety checks, but ultimately for you to space flight, the idea is to minimize vibration. So you do have like vibration isolation systems, and if you look at like John Kennedy and a couple of the guys from St. Mary's, actually, where they did parabolic flight earlier this year with the jump sled that they developed, which was developed in a Pilates studio, actually, interesting. But they looked at jumping on the parabolic flight, so that's something that space agency, I think that's developed further to be basically almost cleared for a technology demonstration in space. So we know jumping is something space agency interested in. So I think that jumping with BFR and then the aerobic side of things is probably where we're going to start. And the difficulty is, like, on Earth, you can't really do any training studies. We can simulate hypergravity, lunar gravity, but we can only look at acute stuff. So we can do the acute crossover type of studies, but we can't do anything chronic unless we get access to bed rest or water bed. So we'll see.
But that would translate. We used to do BFR jumps on the shuttles systems, so basically jumping with 25 or 50 pounds on there, and it's a smoker, man. But we just did it without any reason to say why we're doing it, just to screw with service members.
It's
be good.
It's fun, like doing it in the lunar gravity is really good, because you go up and you're like, oh damn, I'm actually not coming back down straight away, which is actually what that's feeling. But so when you guys come over, we'll have to get you doing that.
Nice.
I don't know. I was a pretty good basketball player in my time. I already know what that feels like. Just floating through the air.
Oh wow.
The epitome of dude. Yeah, if you want to feel like you're a slouch, go hang out with a couple astronauts for a day. They're like 6'2", 6'5", just like rip shape, and guys like, I'm a doctor and a PhD in nuclear physics. It's just like
flight surgeon,
and astronaut.
On the side, I'm a Air Force pilot.
Great. Honestly, it's absolutely crazy. Like this, there's one NASA astronaut, I forget his name. Is it maybe Johnny Kim, who's like
Navy SEAL,
Navy SEAL, medical doctor,
physician.
I'm like, this guy's not actually that. He's like maybe 10 years older than me. I'm like, what have I been doing all this time? Been in the pub too much. I'm in the pub.
No personality at all. None.
Yeah.
Sure, he's boring as hell.
Cool. Any other questions, you guys, or anything else you want to add, Luke? All right, here we go. It's gonna be an hour.
No, it's not. But it's something we have not talked about, and you guys briefly touched on it in your paper. So I'm really kind of curious, largely because there's a very big conversation in like the ACL reconstruction world about the nervous system and how the nervous system is changing after these injuries to the knee. And generally, it's believed presently that the nervous system is changing in large part due to the injury at the level of the knee, the actual tear of the ACL, arthrogenic muscle inhibition, all of those things that have the joint itself is telling the nervous system essentially to kind of change and to use the muscle in a different way. I'm really kind of curious, and no one ever talks about, well, does the muscle feed back on the nervous system? If you just kind of stop using the muscle, does it feed back on the nervous system, and does it change the nervous system in some way, or vice versa? So, and if you think about it, like at some level, it kind of goes back to blood flow again, because we have neurovascular bundles. So, I'm just kind of curious on your end, Luke. What do you feel like we know about? Does the nervous system adapt? Does it not? And how do those things kind of interrelate?
I mean, it's a good point, Carl. I think it makes sense in terms of, as we're starting from the input, almost, is like the lack of the sensory stimulation. as well. Like one of the areas that I know ESA and teams at ESA have been interested in is looking at countermeasures that combine sensory stimulation with exercise. So, for example, being on like an uneven like force plate or something that where you almost like exercising on one of those like half balls where you have to like balance yourself for like neuromuscular control side of things. But I know it would make sense to me that if lack of sensory input would lead to changes coming back out where the muscle's just not activated as much. So it's not as good as turning itself on, which we think is what happens with. I mean, you guys are clinicians, you'll know more than me, but we think that's what happens with the ACL injury side of things, where because you're not using the knee extenders of the quads, that they lose their ability to turn on as quick, that inhibition linked to pain and swelling as well. But I think lack of sensory input would be, a big factor in that.
Right. Yeah.
We're back to we don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know that's kind of where it goes in the end, of course, but I'm just kind of
What's
curious.
Your thoughts, Carl? I feel like you're like in terms of like lack of use, whether that's from an ACL injury or from lack of.
I think it's very hard to remove one from the other and to really tease it out, which is why I have such a problem with us seemingly kind of like tipping our hat to AMI, and it actually being a joint driven thing. I think that it makes a whole lot of sense to me that if you stop using a muscle, that the nervous system goes, hey, hang on a second. We used to be getting a lot more afferent kind of feedback from this region. And it makes a lot of sense that you would see central nervous system changes, like the brain kind of trying to figure out the hell is going on with this quad. It's not doing what it typically would do, and right now you're in a circumstance where you're not using the quad because it freaking hurts to use it, when you put the weight down on the limb. I think if we look farther down the road to the work from Sue Sigward and those and Matt Chang, Sue Sigward gets the mention a lot because everybody knows her name, but Matt Chang also part of that study where they've actually studied. Here we are 6 months later, after this person's had their ACL reconstructed, they've been going through rehabilitation. We watch them move and they look like they are moving normally. But when we actually look at the force plate that we have in their shoe, that's giving us feedback as to how they load that limb, they are still unloading their quad. So this unloading is sustained for a very, very long time after ACL injury. And I feel like the AMI side of things points to, it's because the nervous system's changed, And I'm going, yeah, but you can't remove the disuse piece from that equation, until we do that. For me, I'm like, all right, on my end, I want to know what the hell can I do as a rehab professional? And the thing that I can do is I can, use interventions that will provide activity to the muscle where we're seeing the problem as much as possible, and so that's where I think like minimum effective doses and that sort of thing becomes really, really huge too, because we know how much do you have to do this and what parameters, and for how long post-op does it really matter, Well, and is there a way to kind of figure that out? Do we need people to have force plates on their shoe, to really kind of optimize ACL reconstruction and rehabilitation so we can start figuring out when they actually start using that limb normally? Because watching them walk into our clinic, watching them squat, even measuring their force output, those things don't answer that question. And
it seems almost like it's protective, like it's trying to get you not to use it. And like Chris showed, the muscle changes after these injuries. So if the muscle's like, screw it, I'm going to go stiff, I'm going to give up my satellite cell, content. Let's just change what this limb does now. It seems like it all kind of ties together in this kind of evolutionary stiff limb disuse model.
Yeah. And also with the the casein, Graber-Zargi casein paper showing the decreases in blood flow kind of goes on along with what you're saying, Kyle, as far as we're looking for a single answer, and it's always multifactorial, of course. But, is it really just dumping all this stuff because all the input it's getting is don't use it, or I'm not using it, so I don't really need it as much as well.
And I think it's pretty clear from that 2019 Nobel Prize in Exercise Physiology and Medicine, there's more than 100 different gene responses literally tied to hypoxia.
300.
It's 300. So it is a basic way that our physiology functions. And so I think to just ignore that and not pay attention to it in a situation where, well, we know type 1 fibers are going to go away. What do type 1 fibers use for freaking energy? Oxygen, right? So I just think we're not going to solve this problem until we actually really investigate it thoroughly, I think is where I land. And I just don't think it's been investigated thoroughly. And just looking at the brain and seeing changes when people try to do certain things, it's just not enough of the puzzle. It's interesting for sure, but it's not enough of the puzzle, and it's not freaking solved by blinky glasses.
It's a messy area to kind of separate out.
It is. And I don't want to minimize that. I make jokes about it, but I just think it's like people.
It's tough, and like there's more recent data that shows that there's actual changes in like gray tissue, so white and gray matter after spaceflight, and we don't have data as far as I'm aware. Maybe I've missed it on my corticospinal excitability and inhibition in astronauts. Certainly not in space, but
that's what I'm super curious about. What happens?
There's a guy in Northumbria, a physiologist who's does a lot of like TMS, and he's looking at like corticospinal changes in like postmenopausal women and aging, and actually has some early evidence that corticospinal tract and its function like becomes less efficient with menopause, and it may be a direct result of like a hormone imbalance which occurs in menopause and these changes. So it's like looking at those tracks and how they might adapt to spaceflight, which essentially is reduced loading and reduced sensory stimulation, and using like your ACLs and people as an analog on it, I think is interesting. But those measures are always going to be hard to get in flight. But
so I'm grossed out now. That was too much neuro talk.
As any good podcast ends with us, we've come to
a big shrugging.
We don't really know.
So we just became
answers, and you didn't.
We just became a Cochrane review. What are researchers?
I'm using that.
You just got to make sure you enunciate when you say that word.
Kyle really likes to speak in absolutes, especially when it comes to science around the course. So,
Mr. Black and White.
Yeah.
All right, man. We kept you too long, Luke. I know it's late over there. Thanks, man. I'm happy for you. I know you've always wanted to get into the space side, and dude, I hope one day you become an astronaut and get to go up there, because I know that's your goal. But if not, maybe Wrexham will get promoted and you'll be just as happy.
I might take the latter at the minute, to be honest. I think I might opt for the latter. We'll see.
All right. Thanks, man.
I want to go see a Wrexham game.
Go watch it. It's good.
Yeah.
All right.
We'll sort it out.
Take care, everybody.
See ya.
See you guys.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Owens Recovery Science Podcast. Owens Recovery Science is a single source for PTs, OTs, ATCs, DCs, MDs, and other medical professionals seeking certification in personalized blood flow restriction rehabilitation training. Find them online at owensrecoveryscience.com.
One last thing before you get out of here. Quick moment just to say thanks for listening to the podcast. I think we've probably said it 2 or 3 different times now, but we really mean it. But we also want to make sure that you, when you listen to this podcast, that you understand it's not medical advice. We do our best to make sure the information that we give through this podcast is as accurate as it can be, but it should not be used to treat patients. Those decisions need to be made by a physician, by the appropriate rehab clinician, those people that are licensed to care for that individual in that particular state, nation, etc. And so this also goes for any guests that we bring on the podcast. They're not providing medical advice. This information that you have received here as entertainment should not be taken in that way at all, and it should neither be used as expert witness or testimony in any sort of legal proceedings. So thanks for listening to that and understanding that, and we will see you next time. Or wait, we're not gonna see. We'll hear. No, you'll hear us. Yeah.